We are going to get into an attack by Hillary Clinton supporters saying that Shaun King is not an ally to black people. And that the black is white and white is black and the sky is green and the grass is blue.
Buffalo's a dope animal, like, I mean.
Yeah, it's super cool, yeah.
By now, I'm sure you've all heard about what Cenk's nephew, Hasan Piker, said on Twitch about America, 9/11, and Texas Representative Dan Crenshaw. Cenk later had Hasan on the show to give a classic apology, not apology, where Hasan offered a litany of excuses.
No, I didn't say Americans deserve 9/11. I said America deserves 9/11.
Right, but that's still wrong.
And in that moment, well, maybe you can chalk it up to English being my second language or whatever you want to chalk it up to.
Obviously, I disagree with Hasan, and I think that what he said is gross. But it's actually not too far off from the stuff he usually says on the network. You see, Hasan is a communist. That's not hyperbole. He even has his own show on TYT called Agitprop, which stands for Agitation Propaganda, a term that was coined by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. On this show, Hasan brings on his comrades to talk about how they're going to overthrow the capitalist dogma and what life will be like in the workers' paradise.
Now, this is something that liberals and conservatives alike kind of agree on, where they think anti-fascism is bad, Antifa is bad. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not, okay? It's not bad, it's good.
Hilariously enough, half of the show is typically behind a paywall. Now, if you want to let Comrade Chad host his own show, that's fine, I guess. It's a free country, for now anyways, and no one has to watch. It's actually funny to see Hasan hosting something because he's so terrible at it. But the fact that this show exists says a lot about what the folks over at TYT are willing to tolerate. The only way that it is acceptable to disagree with them is to be further to their left. As far as they're concerned, it's perfectly fine to be a communist or a democratic socialist. Reasonable people can disagree on those things. But God forbid you go slightly to the right of them. At that point, you're a corporate sellout. They have absolutely no patience for the John Delaney's or the Michael Bennetts of the world. Hell, they think Nancy Pelosi is too far right. So why do they think this way? Well, for TYT, it all goes back to money in politics. They believe that progressive positions are popular, that politicians will win by campaigning on them, and that implementing them is the best thing we could do for this country. So why aren't all politicians progressives? Well, it's because of money in politics.
If it isn't really about the popularity, and you have the polling wrong, and you have the analysis of your own home state wrong, and you have the numbers wrong, then what's your real motivation? And so now they'll find this completely out of, oh my, how could you question the fact that I've taken all these corporate donations throughout my entire career, that would influence me? All of this money that the health insurance companies and the drug companies have given me, well, I'm such an angel that would never affect me. Okay, that's what you're saying. And I think that a lot of Americans, in fact, 96% of Americans think that corporate money corrupts politics. Yes. And not in a personal way. Michael Bennett's not at all a bad guy in person, right? But in a systematic way, in a systemic way. It's systemic corruption. So when you tell me you take millions of dollars in corporate donations and that it doesn't affect you, I'm here to tell you that 96% of Americans don't believe you. And you might find that deeply uncomfortable, but that's a reality. Go look up the poll. So your arguments, unfortunately, on the facts and the statistics and the polling don't hold water. That leaves us only one other option as to why you're going in that direction.
Corporations throwing around all that cash prevents us from living in the Scandinavian utopia all of us really want. Like Cenk said, it's nothing personal though. Remember when Ilhan Omar tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamins," when talking about AIPAC? Now, she wasn't being anti-Semitic. She was just talking about the pernicious influence of money in our system.
Nobody's deeply offended. Deeply offended by that? By the words AIPAC? By it's all about the Benjamins in a country where money in politics is so overwhelmingly pervasive? That deeply offended you? I'm deeply offended by your offense.
You see, Omar and TYT both believe that Israel is an evil, right-wing apartheid state. When they argue that politicians support Israel because money they get from AIPAC, they're not being anti-Semitic. They're merely suggesting that their detractors are sociopaths who will look the other way on human rights violations in order to get a few $1,000s in campaign donations. It's nothing personal though. What about the healthcare industry? Our current healthcare system is deeply flawed. I think everyone would agree. TYT would argue that the obvious solution is Medicare for all, and that everybody knows that. It's just that the stakeholders in our current system throw all that money around.
45,000 people die every single year because they don't have health insurance. That's unreal. That's Vietnam level deaths every single year because, hey, you weren't rich enough, your kids weren't rich enough. And so but all of those come back to, because they work for the drug companies, they work for the health insurance companies, they work for the oil companies, they work for the banks, etc.
Politicians who don't support Medicare for all aren't necessarily bad people. They're just willing to accept the deaths of tens of thousands of their fellow Americans so that they can get those campaign donations. Again, it's nothing personal though. What about guns? We undeniably have a problem with gun violence in the US, but what do we do about it? Well, according to TYT, we just implement common sense gun control. Everyone knows it's a good idea. That's why we call it common sense after all. So why don't we go through with it? Well, it's because of the National Rifle Association and all that sweet, sweet cash they throw around.
It's a 3-day waiting period. One of the biggest massacres in the country happened because the guy was allowed to get a gun because they couldn't do the background check in 3 days. So they just want to extend it to 10 days. They do the background check, then you get your gun, okay? It's actually tiny reform. It's actually not going to fix much at all. It's very politically safe. That's why 88% of Americans are in favor of it. Mitch McConnell blocked it.
Yeah.
No waiting period. Sell more weapons. NRA, where's my check?
So if you resist common sense gun control, you're not evil. You're just complicit in America's gun violence problem so that you can get campaign donations from the NRA to win re-election. Again, it's nothing personal though. This is how TYT views almost all issues. Our current campaign finance system is the lifeblood of the systemic corruption that keeps us from solving our major problems. This is why, as a network, they've committed themselves to the effort of getting money out of politics. They want to end direct contributions to campaigns, they want to put an end to lobbying, and they want to put an end to independent expenditures. They view this last one as probably the most important one. There are currently limits on how much an individual can donate to a campaign, after all, but there are no limits on independent expenditures.
I mean, that's literally what we're doing. We're giving money to politicians. That used to be called a bribe. And now but like if you're a person, you have a cap, you can only do 5,400, including the primaries, etc. But if you want to do independent expenditures, there's no limits.
There used to be, but after the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision, all caps on independent expenditures were lifted. This is why Cenk Uygur started his own political action committee, Wolfpack. He wants to lobby state politicians to vote to hold a constitutional convention, to craft an amendment that will overturn the Citizens United decision. In furtherance of this effort, last month, TYT started raising money so that Wolfpack can release a movie promoting their agenda.
All that's going to get done is what is the will of the corporate donors. And a lot of people don't see a way out and they don't see hope. So that's where Wolfpack comes into play, because they actually do have a roadmap to hope, literally. And what they want to do now is they want to show it to you guys. So in order to do that, they got to put together a short movie.
And this is the most hilarious bit of irony at Cenk's expense. Do you know what the Citizens United case was about? Well, the organization Citizens United challenged a Federal Elections Commission violation they were hit with. What FEC regulation did they violate? Did they bribe a politician? Did they give donations without disclosing them? Were they spending money that originally came from a foreign government? No. Citizens United got in trouble for showing a movie. That's right, Hillary the Movie was a 2008 political documentary produced by the nonprofit organization. The movie was offered as an on-demand video on cable before the 2008 Democratic primaries, and therefore was considered electioneering, and the money that was spent on the film qualified as an independent expenditure. According to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, or McCain-Feingold, a corporation, including a nonprofit corporation, cannot advocate for or against a candidate running for office 30 days prior to a primary election or 60 days prior to a general election. So, under this law, a group of people needed the government's permission regarding whether or not they could show a film critical of Hillary Clinton. That's the law that the Citizens United case nullified, and Citizens United is the case that the Young Turks are actively trying to overturn. I'm guessing most of you didn't know those details. Most people don't. It's one of the most misunderstood things in all of American politics. Most people think that this court decision established that money is speech and that corporations are people. Amazingly enough, those two specific phrases that everyone associates with the case never actually appear in either the decision or the dissent. Second of all, neither the concept of corporate personhood nor the connection between money and speech were ever disputed. As constitutional attorney and civil libertarian Glenn Greenwald writes in his partial defense of Citizens United, most commenters, though not all, grounded their opposition to the Supreme Court's ruling in two rather absolute principles. One, corporations are not persons and therefore have no First Amendment/free speech rights, and or two, money is not speech, and therefore restrictions on how money is spent cannot violate the First Amendment's free speech clause. What makes those arguments so bizarre is that none of the 9 justices, including the 4 dissenting justices, argued either of those propositions or believe them. To the contrary, all 9 justices, including the 4 in the dissent, agreed that corporations do have First Amendment rights and that restricting how money can be spent in pursuit of political advocacy does trigger First Amendment protections. As Justice Stevens, who wrote the dissent, says, "Of course, speech does not fall entirely outside of the protection of the First Amendment merely because it comes from a corporation, and no one suggests the contrary." Justice Stevens also wrote that, even though the expenditures at issue were subject to First Amendment scrutiny, these restrictions on these expenditures were justified by compelling state interest. In other words, Stevens believes that spending money on speech is covered under the First Amendment. Congress just has an interest in regulating it in some situations. You see, the legal concept of corporate personhood goes back over 200 years. Remember, a corporation, legally speaking, is just a group of people. Yes, it includes large, multinational, for-profit corporations like Walmart and ExxonMobil. But it also includes labor unions, nonprofit corporations like the ACLU, which endorsed the Citizens United decision, by the way, and small, limited liability corporations. Granting these entities constitutional rights is simply predicated on the idea that individuals don't sacrifice any of their civil liberties when they form into groups. Again, as Greenwald writes, "I'll ask again of you and anyone who claims that since corporations are not persons, they have no rights under the Constitution. Do you believe the FBI has the right to enter and search the offices of the ACLU without probable cause or warrants, and seize whatever they want? Do they have the right to do that to the offices of labor unions? How about your local business on the corner which is incorporated? The only thing stopping them from doing that is the Fourth Amendment. If you believe that corporations have no constitutional rights because they're not persons, what possible objection could you voice if Congress empowered the FBI to do these things? Can they seize the property, the buildings and cars and bank accounts, of those entities without due process or just compensation? If you believe that corporations have no constitutional rights, what possible constitutional objection could you have to such laws and actions? I would add, if corporations don't have constitutional rights, then what is stopping the FBI from doing any of these things to TYT, which, after all, is a corporation? Now, to the point of money in speech. This is just the idea that engaging in speech in any meaningful way, i.e. anything more sophisticated than standing on the street corner and yelling, costs money. Therefore, regulations on the money somebody can spend on speaking is regulating speech by proxy. Think about it. Printing a newspaper costs money. Hosting an online news show costs money. Placing a television ad costs money. Running this YouTube channel costs money, and so on and so forth. Regulating the amount of money someone can spend, where they can get that money, when they can spend it, where they can spend it, etc., undoubtedly jeopardizes the speech itself. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court at the time agreed. This actually goes back to the 1970s Supreme Court case Buckley v. Valeo, where the majority ruled that limits on expenditures are necessarily at odds with the First Amendment because restrictions on spending for political communication necessarily reduces the quantity of that expression. The funny thing is, the folks over at TYT acknowledge that this is actually part of the point of their campaign finance efforts.
And when money is speech, that means that the more money you have, the more speech you have. And if corporations are people who have a lot more money than you and I, that means that corporations have a lot more speech than the rest of us.
They think that it's unfair that some candidates can purchase more advertisements than others, and that needs to be corrected. In Citizens United, the dissenting justices never said that money isn't speech. What they did argue is that Congress had a compelling state interest in regulating it on the grounds of preventing corruption. So, does this money in the system cause corruption? Well, that's not really relevant to the question at hand. As Greenwald explains, critics emphasize that the court's ruling will produce very bad outcomes. Primarily that it will severely exacerbate the problem of corporate influence in our democracy. Even if that is true, it's not really relevant. Either the First Amendment allows these speech restrictions or it doesn't. In general, a law that violates the Constitution can't be upheld because the law produces good outcomes, or because its invalidation would produce bad outcomes. Greenwald thinks that America is too far gone in terms of corporate control of politics. Personally, I think it's a very overrated problem, but it is a problem. And our current campaign finance regime contributes to that problem. But that's not relevant to the speech question. We also have racism in this country, and that's a problem too. Allowing the KKK to hold one of their stupid rallies contributes to that problem. That doesn't mean they don't have the right to hold it. Invoking the state interest isn't really persuasive either. Virtually anything can be justified by that rationale, and that argument has been used to curtail civil liberties in other contexts. So when people talk about limiting independent expenditures, they're actually talking about limiting your ability to engage in political advocacy. Again, the folks over at TYT actually know this. Look at what Cenk said after TYT bought ads against Ted Cruz's 2018 Senate campaign.
Oh, by the way, you might be wondering, wait, isn't the Young Turks a company? Are companies allowed to do that? Yes. You know why? Citizens United. Whoa, hey, wait a minute. Is that fair? No, it's not fair. It's a terrible, terrible ruling. One of the worst rulings in Supreme Court history. Ted Cruz and the other Republicans better hurry up and fix it. Otherwise, we can run ads too. Game on.
So corporations would no longer be able to purchase political advertisement if TYT gets their way. But it might actually be worse than that. Let me explain. TYT seeks to eliminate all independent expenditures. What exactly is an independent expenditure? According to the FEC's website, an independent expenditure is an expenditure for a communication, such as a website, newspaper, TV, or direct mail advertisement, that expressly advocates the election or defeat of a clearly identified candidate, and is not made in consultation or cooperation with or at the request or suggestion of a candidate, candidate's committee, party committee, or their agents. Understand, when Cenk talks about private interests bribing politicians, he's mostly talking about this. For example, listen to Cenk talk about the NRA's electioneering.
You know how much the NRA gave the Republican Party in the 2016 election cycle? $50 million. No one in the country thinks it's anything but a bribe.
Where does he get that $50 million number? Well, when we go to OpenSecrets.org, we see that the NRA gave just over $1 million in campaign donations, and they only spent slightly more than that on lobbying efforts. Where they spent most of their money, or bribes according to Cenk, was in outside spending, which includes independent expenditures. Yes, this is money spent on advertising, but that's just run-of-the-mill electioneering. And here's the thing they don't get about the NRA's campaign ads. They're only as good as the reputation of the organization itself. One of the things the NRA does is score various votes that candidates make and gives them a letter grade based on that. A large amount of the $54 million they spend is devoted to distributing this information. And the thing is, the information is value neutral. We've all heard Republican politicians boast in their own ads about their good marks from the NRA. At the same time, we've heard the opposite too. Multiple Democratic presidential candidates, including Bernie Sanders, have boasted about how the NRA views them as a threat because of their bad score.
Virtually every campaign that I have been in where the NRA and the gun folks have had a position, they voted and supported, opposed me. In fact, I have about a D- record from the NRA.
The difference here is obvious. Those who are pro-gun will likely be receptive to an NRA endorsement, while those who are pro-gun control will have the opposite view. I actually know people who are very pro-Second Amendment who don't care for the NRA for various reasons. For these people, the endorsement carries very little weight as well. So the money the NRA has spent on campaign ads is not bribery, nor is it undemocratic. Quite the opposite. Most of what they spend money on is relaying information to the body politic, and the voters do the rest. Fundamentally, it's no different than when an organization like the Sunrise Movement endorses politicians, which they've done, including a number of Justice Democrats. All they're doing is communicating to voters who they think the best candidates are, based on their ideological perspective. How is that not bribery by TYT Logic? The reason why Cenk and company rail against groups like the NRA, and not against groups like the Sunrise Movement, is because they share the goals of the latter, and they think the former is tricking people to some nefarious end.
Mitch McConnell and a lot of the Republicans trick their voters with money. What does the money do? They get the money from the NRA and then they run ads. They overwhelm sometimes Democrats in their races with ads.
In other words, Cenk's real beef is that he doesn't like the politics of these organizations, and he's bitter that they're more successful than progressive groups. He wants to stop them from advertising, because he thinks that voters don't know what's in their best interests and will continually be fooled by TV ads. But aren't these outside organizations trying to influence the process? Yes, that's exactly the point. They're not doing that by bribing politicians, though. They're doing it by persuading voters to take political action for or against a given politician. The funny thing is, this is absolutely no different than the electioneering that TYT is engaged in. Remember the progressive pledge that TYT issued to Democratic candidates? They said outright that the point of this was to impact the race.
If it does work, we could change politics in America.
The Young Turks regularly support and electioneer on behalf of politicians from the Justice Democrats. In fact, there's arguably a stronger link between TYT and the Justice Democrats than there is between other politicians and the outside groups that support them. With the Justice Democrats, there's direct coordination. Kyle Kulinski, co-founder of the Justice Democrats, has even said that TYT and Secular Talk were supposed to be the media arm of the organization.
I was a co-founder of Justice Democrats, and outside of being a co-founder, I wrote the platform, and then also, basically Cenk and I are the marketing arm of Justice Democrats, where we have large audiences and we tell everybody, hey, this is what we're about, this is what we're fighting for, you should get involved.
They still functionally serve that role, even though Kyle and Cenk are no longer formally involved with the organization. TYT often talks about media coverage given to candidate Trump during the 2016 election in terms of dollar amount.
And according to IQ Media, a media monitoring service, the advertising value of that hour and 14-minute long play by Fox News was $1.9 million that they handed to Donald Trump by playing that.
So why is it okay for TYT to spend money making videos to plug Justice Democrats like AOC and others, but it's not okay for an organization to spend money to produce a commercial and air it on TV? Functionally, what is the difference? There is none. The videos TYT makes plugging Bernie Sanders or Justice Democrat politicians are functionally just campaign ads. The only difference is that TYT agrees with the politics of Justice Democrats, while they mostly disagree with the politics of politicians who are supported by outside organizations. This was a point made by Ben Shapiro in his debate with Cenk.
As far as the idea that all money should be out of politics, here's the problem. Okay, TYT, we both have corporations, and we expound upon politics every single day. And we motivate thousands of people, right, every day, on both sides of the aisle. That is effectively an in-kind contribution. Now, you campaigned with Bernie Sanders. Did you do it because you expected? That's fine. Did you do that because you supported Bernie Sanders, or did you do that because you expected some gimme for TYT in return? I assume you did it because you supported Bernie Sanders, right?
Yes.
So, okay, so the point that I am making is to attribute to everyone else bad intent when it comes to political spending in politics, but to yourself it's totally fine. And when it comes to other media entities that give in-kind contributions on a regular basis through their coverage, this is when the New York Times, which is biased to the left, spends an inordinate amount of time and money reporting on Mitt Romney's idiotic stories about how he was in high school and cutting a gay kid's hair in 1932. If you're saying to me that that is less impactful on the political sphere than a corporation, which is a group giving money to a political candidate for purposes of supporting that candidate, I fail to see how you can say for yourself that you are innocent in this, but everyone else is guilty. I don't believe that. Either everyone's guilty or everybody is innocent, or if you can find the actual cases of guilt where there's a quid pro quo, then we agree. That's prosecutable.
By the way, one of the reasons that media companies like NBC and the New York Times were able to operate as they did during the McCain-Feingold era was because the law erroneously made specific exceptions for media companies. So, fundamentally, at the heart of this whole money in politics issue is just regular TYT nonsense. Cenk thinks that money put forward for libertarian or conservative or even moderate Democrat causes is quid pro quo by definition, because no one would ever actually genuinely support any of those causes unless they were bought off. This is why it's okay when TYT advocates for progressive politics, but it's corruption when right-wing actors advocate for their agenda.
They like to play hardball, we like to play hardball. We're not your daddy's liberal, okay? And so now in their case, I think they're doing it for a bad cause, and I think they're doing it for profit. In our case, we're doing it for the exact opposite, to remove the profit motive from politics.
Just look at what they said when David Koch died.
One of the things they're doing is feeding into the propaganda that the Koch brothers have some sort of philosophical libertarian principles and that that's what's driving them. No. Corruption is driving them.
All of that money he spent in electioneering and on organizations like Cato and the Reason Foundation wasn't because he actually believed in libertarian ideas. It was because he wanted to enrich himself. David Koch is no angel, but their only evidence that this was his broader goal, as far as I can tell, is that he held libertarian politics. Yet when TYT, which has received millions of dollars in investments, plugs progressive ideas, it's because they're virtuous and they actually care about other people. And their evidence that they actually care about other people is that they hold progressive politics.
Progressives, unlike conservatives, care about other people.
There are no legitimate disagreements with people to their right. Media that is supporting progressives is just part of democracy. Media that supports non-progressives is propaganda. Progressives are good, and anyone to their right is evil.
And they go from victim to victim to victim because they are the bad guys of history. They are.